on the WEEB landing page for the Pathways Initiative, we do have a posted recording that is a 3-hour detailed summary of all of these different areas of our proposal. And so if you have additional questions about the information that is presented today or detail, that recording is posted and gets into, I think, some of the excruciating details of some of these different elements. We'll talk a little bit through a timeline for step 2, and then hopefully have time at the end of this for your questions and comments. Next slide, please. So first, I want to talk about what the Pathways Initiative is and what it is not. So the Pathways Initiative came out of a request from regulators from several Western states, including Oregon, Washington, California, Arizona, and New Mexico, to really evaluate whether there are changes that could be made that would remove governance as a barrier to participation in a market that has the largest footprint possible, that includes California. And the regulators really are identified from some studies that they had done that leaving a footprint outside that does not include California would not really serve to maximize the potential benefits from a Western market. The challenge was to shift to the governance of the California market, where currently the California ISO is overseen by a board that is appointed by the governor of California, to really find a pathway to fully independent governance that is independent in both perception and reality. However, while doing so, we wanted to preserve and build on the existing CAISO market structures that currently offer services to over 80% of the Western interconnection and support the Western energy imbalance market and the extended day ahead market without incurring duplication or of costs or other financial challenges. We wanted to build on the success of the platform that is in place today, as well as provide a pathway to a full RTO in the future as the region is ready for that next step. However, as on this slide we're showing, the current focus of the Pathways Initiative is specifically on the energy markets. Previous initiatives or previous attempts at California governance reform had tried to tackle the entirety of the CAISO structure, including the balancing authority and transmission planning functions that are deeply intertwined with some of the California state legislation around energy policy. However, we found a pathway where a focus specifically on the energy markets, which is the step that the region is ready to take today, enabled the conversation and an unwinding of some previous barriers with our California colleagues to enable that full independence specifically for energy markets. That includes the Western energy imbalance market and the extended day ahead market, but maintains the current CAISO governance structure for the services that are not being taken by Western utilities, including transmission planning and transmission operations, and the balancing authority services that are provided by CAISO to California utilities, but are performed by utilities themselves outside of the CAISO footprint. Next slide, please. So where we are today, the launch committee has put forward its recommendation for option 2.0. And before we get into these details, I want to quickly identify that we had in the spring issued a proposal called Step 1. Our Step 1 proposal took the joint authority model between the CAISO board and the Western market governing body from a joint authority model to a primary authority model. And that Step 1 proposal was approved by the CAISO board and the WEM governing body in August and should be filed with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in early November. That enables a primary authority model where for the tariff changes that apply to the energy markets, they would first go to the Western Energy Market Governing Body, and if approved by that body, would become part of the consent agenda for the CAISO board. This was a step that was very important for many of our utility colleagues, including NV Energy, who had advocated for this primary authority model as a significant advancement towards the independence of the Western Energy Market Governing Body. And we are looking forward to the implementation of that proposal once the triggering threshold is met, which is 70% of the utilities whose load equals 70% of the current CAISO balancing authority load have a signed implementation agreement, and that load has diverse regional representation, including load from the Pacific Northwest and the Desert Southwest. While PacifiCorp and Portland General have signed our implementation agreements, we believe that if all of the utilities, well, the triggering threshold will be met if all of the utilities or a majority of the utilities who have indicated a preference for the EDM also get to that signature point, that step one will go into effect. So focusing now on step two. So step two creates a fully independent organization that would have sole authority for market rules that apply to the Western Energy Imbalance Market or the extended day ahead market. This initially would be a policy setting board where the board would have that sole authority over approving tariff changes, but where the obligations for compliance and accountability would continue to be part of the CAISO board. And we've gotten a lot of questions about, and so then over time, we envision that this new organization, which would be established as a 501c3 nonprofit corporation, headquartered in Delaware with a primary place of business potentially in Folsom, California, but with the board having that opportunity to set that at a future date. We've gotten a lot of questions that why we wouldn't start with a position further out over time. We do see that once option 2.0 is created, that organization will have the opportunity to continue to evolve and to build some of the assets and the structures needed to take over additional implementation oversight over the market. But the way we're really envisioning this is that option 2.0 helps plant a seed, and that seed can then grow in time to take over that more fulsome responsibility through a contract relationship with the CAISO to really enable the region to evolve more quickly. The launch committee is a group of 26 volunteers. We all have day jobs, and there is no real institutional host for the launch committee or for the Pathways Initiative. And our group has really come together and donated a significant amount of time and energy to getting this Pathways Initiative stood up. But there are certain barriers and challenges of running this kind of organization on a voluntary basis. I joke with my family that I have a day job and then another day job with our EDM implementation, and then the Pathways Initiative has become my hobby. It's what I do in my free time. And so in order to really jumpstart the continued growth and evolution of this organization, we see option 2.0 as a way to get a foundation and to bring that fully independent board into place as soon as possible, and then give that organization the resources needed to, and the staffing, particularly the paid staffing needed to really help that organization evolve to acquire some additional independent attributes, including potentially having its own tariff and to having that compliance and oversight responsibility for the markets themselves. That compliance and oversight responsibility includes being the responsible entity for any potential charges associated with a compliance violation. And so that organization needs some runway to build up those kinds of capital and financial reserves to take on that kind of obligation. And we see this as a way to ease that transition process and enable that transition to take place gradually over time and consistent with the direction of the region on a pathway and a timeline that that starts as soon as possible and provides that sole authority as early as possible, and then gives the organization an opportunity to evolve over time. Our long-term vision is that the regional organization will be able to offer on a voluntary basis any additional services that are desired by Western stakeholders up to and including full RTO support. We recognize that RTOs evolve in many different ways, and that at least some RTOs, including MISO, started out with multiple balancing authorities underneath that RTO umbrella, and that this pathway, this structure enables that same kind of evolution for the region, as long as there are interested parties who want to take those services. We see that additional market evolution could continue to be on a menu of options basis. We could see some utilities who, like today, where the energy imbalance market is one option and the extended day ahead market is a second option. We see some utilities who are interested in taking that next step to join the extended day ahead market, but other utilities who are content to stay at that first Western energy imbalance market option, or even consider options that are outside of this process. But that we could consider additional services that could be opted into on this menu of services basis, like the provision or the co-optimization of ancillary services, the operation of an interconnection queue or a transmission planning service, a common transmission tariff. But again, we would need to see interest in these kinds of enhancements in order for the regional organization to want to undertake a stakeholder initiative to provide them. Next slide, please.
Questions at the end or during the presentation?
I think probably
Jennifer, yeah, Pam, go ahead. Sorry. Let's hold questions until the end, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our proposal includes a number of elements around independence. And I can touch on each of these highly, but there are significant emphasis both on independence, and then another core component of our proposal is ensuring that this organization is operating in the public interest. One of the interesting things that I have done as co-chair of the Pathways Initiative is read a lot of academic literature on RTO governance and the role of the public interest how to get the public interest embedded in RTO governance. And there are several tools that we have incorporated that really aim to bring that public interest standard into the organization itself. The first is around independence. We see the board from day one, the RO board will have sole 205 filing rights over the areas of the tariff that are specifically related to the Western energy imbalance market, ahead market. It will have sole authority over those business practice manuals and have an independent board that is independent of any state interest, any financial interest in the market. It will be a separate and independent legal entity so that it has its own oversight of that corporate structure, and will have a contractual relationship with the CAISO for services in order to minimize any costs and duplication of costs associated with that full independence of the board. We've added joint reporting for the independent market monitor, the Department of Market Monitoring, so that the DMM will have joint oversight between the CAISO board and the independent board and provide the same kind of access around data to states and consumer advocates so that there continues to be diligent data access and oversight through the DMM as a source for independent information. We also include dedicated staff to the regional organization, as well as some certain advisory input into the selection of leadership roles at the CAISO who will have oversight over the Western market operations. And that kind of contractual established relationship and engagement between the CAISO as the vendor and the regional organization as the oversight body to really ensure that those organizations remain in alignment and that the operations of the market are consistent with the oversight of the independent board of the regional organization. Into the public interest specifically, we propose a number of reforms to the CAISO stakeholder process. We see this as a RO-led but CAISO-supported stakeholder process where we recommend the establishment or we recommend the evolution of what is today known as the Regional Issues Forum into a body of sector representatives and diversify the number of sectors that we have represented under this new body, while maintaining a one entity, one vote approach to engagement with any particular stakeholder initiative. We did an extensive evaluation of the percentage-based mandatory voting approaches of Eastern markets. And after an extensive dialogue, including 5 public workshops that GridWorks facilitated for the Pathways Initiative, we concluded that, frankly, under voting, a lot of these voting structures, almost no one is happy with the percentage of weighted vote that they have. And so rather than try to divvy up the pie in a way that was going to make no one happy, we continue to recommend the single entity, single point of engagement approach to the stakeholder process and market evolution, while also having indicative voting that can be aggregated and tabulated across many different ways so that the independent board has a deeper insight into the perspectives of the stakeholder community. So for example, we recommend that the indicative voting be tabulated based on load share and geographic diversity so that the board would have insight into whether a particular initiative might have general support, but might have particular opposition from, say, the Desert Southwest. And we've seen over time that there are some unique issues, particularly to the Desert Southwest or the Pacific Northwest, that need to be worked through and really have those issues that the regional differences that are driving a divergence in perspective have an opportunity to be resolved as long as they are clearly defined and articulated and balanced. And so we believe that this indicative voting with cross-tabulation of votes will provide the independent board the level of information they need in order to support the ability to resolve these kind of regional differences or maybe cross-sector differences where, for example, the independent power producers and utilities might come at an issue differently. We think that this will help provide more integration and collaboration at the stakeholder representatives committee level, and we hope to see more direct engagement and stakeholder-led process as we move through market evolution. For the body of state regulators, we want to really ensure that all states have a vote, or not a vote, I'm sorry, there was a voice in the market evolution process. And one of our key principles is that that market evolution does not negatively impact, market evolution both accommodates and does not negatively impact any state's particular public policies. We do have a body of state regulators that has a similar role to the BOSSR as it has today, with a lot of engagement between the regional organization and the BOSSR around market evolution and helping to shape that, as well as establishing a public policy committee of the board that would check in regularly with the body of state regulators to ensure that the road mapping process and the prioritization process was accommodating any changes to the market needed for compliance with state and local public policy initiatives, as well as to ensure that the market was not going to adversely impact any state's compliance with state and local public policy requirements. We also are establishing a new separate, fully separate 501c3. So a regional organization will have its own 501c3 and then another 501c3 that would represent the consumer advocates. The consumer advocates have long talked about establishing something similar to what is called the Consumer Advocates of PJM States, or the CAPS organization, which is a tariff-funded organization in PJM that represents all of the state consumer advocate agencies that are established through state statute in the PJM stakeholder process. We propose to create an analogous organization for the West, which would help the states with state-sanctioned consumer advocates, which is all of the states around the West except potentially Idaho. Those state consumer advocate offices would be able to work with this new organization, and that organization would be staffed in a way to provide a voice for consumer advocates in the stakeholder process. And finally, we are recommending an Office of Public Participation to be headquartered at the regional organization. This is based off of a new office that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has created to facilitate public engagement in the regulatory process. And I don't know if you have seen their primer on Western markets, but it is an excellent entry document into the history of Western market evolution and an excellent summary of the state of affairs today. And our public interest organizations have seen the success of the FERC Office of Public Participation and have recommended that we include one for the regional organization to help facilitate that engagement from a more diverse set of stakeholders. For the next slide, please. So again, I wanted to just reiterate where we are in this process. Step one, to make the Energy Imbalance Market governing body the primary authority with a jump ball 205 rights at FERC. Step two, we're transferring governance from the joint bodies to a new regional organization with sole authority over market rules. And then as we are thinking about the evolution of that new regional organization, we recognize that that organization will continue to grow and expand to provide the scope of services that are driven by Western market stakeholders and Western market participants to really enable that regional organization to grow and flourish. I have a couple more slides that have a lot of words on them with our principles and our founding information, but I think that this is a good opportunity to pause and take questions that you may have.
That's great. Thank you so much, Pam, for that summary. I'll go ahead and open it up to the task force for questions, and then I'll wrap up with mine. That looks like Luis. Yeah, go ahead, Luis.
So most of the questions, they were answered with the slide that you have after. I was wondering out loud. But just to make sure that all are covered. So what size the board will be what will be the size of the board? How many members?
We're recommending a 7-member board to oversee the regional organization. We are taking comments on the size of that board, but our current recommendation is a 7-member board. That would be an expansion of 2 from the current 5-member board that is the current Western Market governing body.
Thank you. And the organization, what will be the manpower required? How many persons will be the staff? What
So
is the
we
expected
envision,
number? Expected.
okay, so I remember my budget numbers better than I do my exact staffing numbers. So we recommend starting the regional organization off with a year 1 budget of $1.5 to $2.3 million that recognizes the challenge of staffing in just even the basic hiring process. So that would cover the board and executive director, some funding for council, and probably about 3 staff for its year 1 operations. I'll say I'm a strong advocate of this because I've been trying to hire for my EDM implementation team for the last 4 months, and I've got like 2 out of 12 positions like fully filled. So I recognize that it's going to take some time to just even get the hiring process done. We estimate that over time, over the first few years of operations, that the regional organization would evolve into a budget of $5 to $10 million, and that would reflect a staff of probably 15 to 25 people. I believe that those are the numbers. I will have to double check with our step 1 proposal, but that and that those would reflect those functions, especially an emphasis on, especially the emphasis on like the legal oversight of the tariff, the Office of Public Participation, and some stakeholder facilitation work. But that over time, as the organization evolves, we can see additional responsibility either shift to the regional organization from the CAISO or other types of approaches to get that staffing to include that compliance oversight of the tariff that would take place as the organization gets stood up and has additional evolution.
Thank you. And my last question, how do you compare to other existing RTOs in the East or other regions? How this sizing both for board and staff compares to those already established RTOs?
So from a board perspective, I think we're fairly comparable. I honestly don't remember the full range of board size for Eastern RTOs. From a staffing perspective, we are significantly smaller, really because this organization is a oversight organization and has a contract for services relationship to the California ISO. Our primary goal is to not duplicate requirements and to really minimize the costs of standing up this independent board. And so our staffing reflects those that are those requirements to have independence, but not to have duplication.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, it looks like Leslie Mojica has her hand up.
Yes, good afternoon. Just for the sake of clarity and transparency, the board members, it's not a volunteer board, they're going to get paid?
Correct. So all RTO boards are paid positions across every single RTO is a paid position. And Leslie, maybe I might say a few more words on that. You know, I think in talking to our current governing body members, they spend a good at minimum of 20 to, honestly, sometimes 40 hours a week on board work. And so this does require someone who is willing to dedicate the time. We expect them not only to read the board briefing materials and to really understand the issues that are coming before them, but also to do engagement and outreach to the stakeholder community in order to understand stakeholder perspectives on the board. The majority of board members are retired professionals from a diverse array of backgrounds, including HR and legal. We have some academics. We have many former state regulators who have been on the board or are currently on the board, including Rebecca, who was a former regulator for the Nevada Commission. But the board generally is a job. We want our board members to be engaged and to attend functions and to be available to deeply understand the issues and the perspectives that the stakeholder community are bringing to evaluate those proposals. And that it's a pretty intensive requirement.
Great. Thanks, Pam. Ernest Figueroa had his hand up.
Hello, Pam. This is Ernest. I would first of all want to thank you for this nice summary of what's going on with the Pathways Initiative. It's very, thank you again. I really appreciate it. And then secondly, I have more of a comment than a question. Secondly, my comment is, I want to personally thank Michelle Beck for leading the effort of the Western Consumer Advocates, providing the comments necessary to the Pathways Initiative. Obviously, looking at your presentation, a lot of our comments were well received. So thank you very much. And thank you to Michelle.
Well, I also appreciate your engagement with her. Michelle has been just a tireless voice for the consumer advocates, going all the way back to the Governance Review Committee. And she's just been an excellent advocate for the consumer interests and really helped bring forward a lot of the components of this proposal. And as we're really working to center this governance structure in the public interest, making sure that we have the voices of the customer themselves, especially our smallest residential and small commercial customers, adequately represented is something that she's strongly advocated for. And I hope I'm glad that you see the positions she's taken and the suggestions she's brought woven through this.
Great. Thank you so much, Ernest, for the comment and the recognition. Any other task force members have questions? Okay. I just have a couple of questions, Pam. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to bring us the updated status of the Pathways Initiative. Really great to hear of the continued progress. You mentioned a couple of items, the webinar that was about 3 hours long, you said that would let you deep dive, as well as that Western Market Primer. Wanted to see if, as a follow-up, you could send links to those so that we could put those on the website with other resources. That's the easy question.
Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. I know you mentioned MISO and how it had kind of developed out of a multiple set of balancing authorities. And I wanted to see if, when you were working on this, or even just in your own observations, especially from the perspective of a utility, was there anything within the MISO development that, as you look at a regional organization from the perspective, again, as of a utility with ratepayers that you are there to help protect, was there anything good or bad within that development that you would say, like, this is definitely something we should look at, this is something we should definitely stay away from, and at a really high level, just to kind of get a sense of what we might be looking at as the progress towards a Western regional market moves further along?
So maybe I'll add, we've reached out to we've evaluated all of the RTO governance structures in the Eastern markets, and we've worked pretty extensively with both MISO and with ISO New England, who ISO New England has an organization called NEPOOL, which is a stakeholder organization that really has shared 205 filing rights with FERC, which is a lot of the foundation for our step one proposal. So I think we've worked really hard to incorporate different elements from the Eastern markets that resonate with Western consumers. I mentioned the CAPS organization from PJM that we are that we're bringing that concept into this process, and hopefully our consumer advocates will shape that organization into the way that they want it for a Western CAPS. But I mean, I think there's certain challenges that we see in Eastern markets. I mean, I think transmission cost allocation has been a significant barrier to, or a significant pain point across the board for transmission development and transmission planning. I think we've seen some of the challenges with the capacity markets, especially recently with PJM having record high capacity prices, and that a lot of our proposal here is trying to find those areas where customers have benefited unequivocally. And I think that energy market optimization is the area where RTOs have really clearly had success in lowering cost to customers and working to optimize existing assets for the benefit of the region. And that is really where we are with the Step 2 proposal, focused specifically on energy markets. And I think what the unique opportunity of the Pathways Initiative is that we can continue to take that incremental approach that has been successful for the West. I think we have the EDAM proposal that has a FERC-approved tariff, and PGE and PacifiCorp and others are starting to develop our own tariffs to implement that market. But that as we think, if we look toward the horizon around what other elements of an RTO we would like to incorporate, we have the ability to come together to do those incrementally and in a way that avoids some of the pitfalls of the East, and I think hopefully leapfrogs in technology, so that we find the areas of commonality for common benefit without having some of the drawbacks that we're seeing manifest today.
Great. Thank you, Pam. I just have two more quick questions. So, is there any legislation in California that would be needed to implement this? And if so, like, where are you on that status, and what's the likelihood of that actually being successful this go round?
So that's a great question. So we do have a limited legislative change that is necessary to fully implement Step 2 of the Pathways Initiative. We are working to finalize our proposal by November 22nd of this year. And then once we have finalized that proposal, the members of the Launch Committee, who are also active in the California legislature, picking up that package and starting to build a process to run a bill in California. It's not a Launch Committee activity, but it does have members of the Launch Committee who are working to move that process forward. Unlike previous attempts at California legislative change, we have the folks who take full credit for killing all previous initiatives really on our side here, particularly California Labor, and then some members of California Public Power who were fundamentally opposed to the full regionalization of the ISO market, particularly for the reasons I shared earlier around the relationship between the CAISO Balancing Authority and California public policy. And actually, in many ways, I think the approach that we're taking here, because we are not touching all of those areas to the right of energy markets on my, I think, third slide, we are able to build a stronger coalition within California. And we think we have a very clear path to success. I mean, there's nothing sure in politics until the bill is signed, but we do have support in a way that we did not before for this opportunity to create more parity between the regional organization and its oversight specifically of markets, without some of the additional encumbrances around state legislation. And I think the same concerns that drove California's opposition in the past, I think also help with some of our Western state colleagues as well, because the goal of this regional organization is that each state's own self-determination around its energy journey is front and center. That is the primary goal of the public policy and the oversight of this regional organization. It means that California can run in the direction it wants to, and Nevada can go in the direction it wants to, and that they can come together under, I think, the principles that no matter where our politics lie, I think we all agree that reliability and affordability are the two most important things that a market can provide. And this, I think, helps us center around those values and allows each state to center its own resource decisions, while bringing the region together to advance those two values.
Okay, great. And then finally, kind of teeing off of that a little bit, I just wanted to maybe have you talk in terms of the voting structure. You sort of addressed the general principle of how Nevada's policy interests would be protected. But I wanted to see maybe to hear you talk just a little bit more about what that voting structure that you discussed would look like for Nevada, since we've got one investor-owned utility that has the bulk of the state, and how that voting structure again ensures or provides safeguards that Nevada does not have its policies or its governance dictated by California.
That's a great question. So in the stakeholder process, and I'm going to look, I think we have slide 19 of the appendix goes through a little bit of the stakeholder process. So just for everyone's understanding, so there's a lot of, that slide. So there, I included our detailed slides in the appendix if anyone wants to really dig into some of the additional details behind the proposal. There's 133 pages of them, so there's a lot of detail behind what I've shared with you today. But the idea here is that we have a number of different sectors that are represented in the Stakeholder Representatives Committee. And that, as you know, NV Energy, as well as the consumer advocate, who would have representation through their sector, that each entity would have the opportunity to voice their perspective, and again, remaining centered around stakeholder comments. We do have in our oversight documents as well, in the recommendations around the corporate charter, that all state and local public policies would be preserved, so that even as we're going through this complicated diagram on this slide, that the RO board would also be chartered to be working with the body of state regulators, who would then be able to identify and collaborate with that board to raise any issues where they saw a conflict between the way a stakeholder initiative was proceeding and their own state public policy. And again, I think, and so since that criteria is really framed as front and center in the RO decision-making responsibility, that if the state of Nevada thought that that a market proposal would negatively impact their state public policy, they would work directly with the board to identify that and then raise that issue and hopefully bring it to resolution through the public policy process.
Okay, great, thanks. I want to move on because it's we've got other presenters, and I know you had a conflict, but I don't know, Eric Hansen just dropped a question in the chat about 704B customers being represented on the board and the level of intervention or authority that those customers would have. I don't know, Pam, if that's something that you can answer now, if you're aware of the 704B customers in Nevada and their status and work. Otherwise, possibly that could be something you could provide to us in maybe a written response after the fact, if that, you just tell me
Yes.
how you prefer to proceed.
I do not know what a 704B customer is, so
Okay.
I'll have to work with my Nevada colleagues to understand that better.
Okay. Okay. Is that okay, Eric? We can get you a response in written form after this meeting.
Yeah, that'd be fine. And 704B customers are the largest customers in Nevada, so that don't buy they're not bundled retail customers. So all of the large resorts, data centers, mines, things like that don't buy their power from NV Energy. They buy it on the open market.
Okay.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Eric, for that question. Good question. If there are no other questions from the task force, we'll go ahead and Pam, let you get back to, I know you had another meeting, so thank you so much again for the incredible detail. I know, again, that this was a very long presentation, but since this is a developing and sort of live discussion about what Pathways is going to look like, I think it's really important to spend that time. All right. So
Thank you
with
so
that-
much.
Thank you again, Pam. Really appreciate it. All right. So with that, we will move to our next speaker, Ben Fleischman with Interwest Energy Alliance, and he is going to talk to us about long-term regional planning in the West. So Ben, I will let you take it away.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Can you hear me? Just quick sound check.
Yep, can hear you great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. I'm going to talk about a couple of elements of long-term regional transmission planning in the West. My name is Ben Fleischman. I'm Director of Markets and Transmission Work at Interwest Energy Alliance. Next slide, please. So just brief, in part just to keep myself organized, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition, also known as WestTech, and then talk a bit about Order 1920 and what our hopes and expectations are for its implementations in the West. Real briefly, next slide, just so you know who I am and who's talking to you. The Interwest Energy Alliance is a regional trade association of around 50 member organizations. You see them here. Our members develop grid scale wind, solar, transmission lines, and batteries in the desert Southwest, including Nevada, and a total of 6 Intermountain Rockies states. We have about, across this membership, there's about 20 gigawatts of generation online in this region and another 20 gigawatts or so in development. Next slide, please. So on the right here, you've got a map of the regional planning groups. In the West, blue is the Northern Grid, yellow, orange is West Connect, green is the CAISO, and then there's a little bit of the lighter yellows overlap areas between Northern Grid and West Connect. Just to kind of set the table and give you a frame of reference, what happens in these areas is regional transmission planning. So that's Order 1000 planning right now, which is multi-utility planning, essentially a roll-up of what individual utilities do in their local transmission planning. And then across the region, across these regions, the 3 regions, there's interregional coordination, which is essentially an annual meeting where the groups get together to coordinate on any projects that are occurring in their areas that they're modeling, but it's a fairly limited bit of interregional coordination. So that's just very briefly high level landscape of what's happening in the West. And then on top of this, we have the new Western Transmission Expansion Coalition, which is a voluntary effort, which is to say it's not any of these FERC-ordered planning processes. It's a coalition of the willing. It involves entities from across the entire West, including the transmission owners and transmission providers across this entire footprint that you see. This, so the same geographic area, but under one study effort here. And we're aiming to be some things that FERC transmission planning is not. We're aiming to be inclusive and expedient, and in particular, transparent. And so far, I think we're doing this well. I'll show a timeline shortly so you understand where we're at in this effort. But a key factor, I think, right now in what this effort is that it has broad participation, not just from transmission owners and utilities, but also companies that develop transmission lines independently, merchant transmission developers, also trade associations representing generation developers, like organizations like myself, trade associations representing merchant generation independent power producers, as well as other experts, including national labs, the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, and others with expertise in transmission modeling and planning. So it is a big tent right now, which is so far working together well. Next slide, please. What we're aiming to do is a first of its kind West-wide transmission study. It is a study only, and so I just want to emphasize that there's no jurisdictional teeth here. There's no cost allocation at play. It's information that we're aiming to produce through a broad and collaborative participatory effort. What we are trying to do is spur action from the information that this study produces. And so several ways we've envisioned this the study work spurring action is by providing inputs by way of ideas for new transmission developments that could be studied in existing local and regional transmission planning processes. Providing data and results useful to evaluate the benefits from a specific new potential transmission project or portfolio of projects. And to the extent that these projects appear beneficial and promising, and that there are entities who want to pursue their development, and such entities could be utilities, existing transmission owners, or merchant developers, or there are some states in the West, like Colorado and New Mexico, that have state transmission authorities who might want to take on one of these projects. The hope is to initiate the negotiations, whether that's bilateral between potential utility partners or between a utility partner and a independent transmission company, but to start getting the ball rolling on efforts to actually take some of the study ideas, the transmission expansion options that the study produces, and turn them into steel on the ground. In addition to negotiation between the potential developers, we're hopeful that the study, which will kind of propose or at least identify potential routing corridors, can also spur proactive engagement with affected communities and the state agencies and regulators who may be involved. And then ultimately, we're hopeful that this effort will, by virtue of its transparency and wide participation, be a very credible resource for regulators when prudency decisions ultimately land on the desk to evaluate cost recovery requests. So that's what WestTech is intended to be. On the next slide, I'll show a brief timeline. And there's a lot of information here. I have at the very last slide of this deck, which this deck is too long, has too many words, and I apologize for not taking the time to make it shorter. I'll call your attention to the important parts and then gladly be available to follow up with any questions. But the very last slide in the deck has links to a handful of resources. In particular, the WestTech website, which you can easily find by Googling WestTech WPP. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump there, just letting folks know it's there when needed. But on the WestTech timeline, this timeline, sorry, slide 6, I think, there we are. This timeline and a bunch of supporting information on the WestTech effort are available on the WestTech website. So there's a lot more information there, but we're well underway with a lot of participation from entities across the West, including majority of transmission owners and others, like I mentioned, have approved a study scope that was finalized in the end of August and are now in the early stages of developing a 10-year transmission study, which will come out in target is midsummer in August 2025. That's the yellow star at the bottom middle there. And then a 20-year report just over a year later in September of 26. That's the second yellow star. And the red star there lets you know where we are marching along the timeline. So that is the WestTech effort. Just wanted to give a brief overview of what that is. That's definitely high level, and there's a lot more to it. But I wanted to let folks know what that is and what's happening, especially as we think about what we expect Order 1920 to do. Next slide, please. So just a reminder, we've got transmission planning happening at the three major stages right now: local transmission planning, regional planning, and interregional planning. And then on top of that, you have the merchant projects that have been developed outside of the planning process. And so what this big mess amounts to is single utility plans that are then submitted in regional planning in what's often referred to as a bottom-up process, essentially a sum of local plans, as opposed to a top-down process where you look broadly at the region and think about what big projects might meet many local needs. It's kind of the opposite in reality, where you have local plans for specific transmission owners then being kind of thrown together or added up to produce a regional plan. And so I think there's a lot of people are frustrated with that, and that frustration is part of what gave rise to West Tech. So next, advance one slide, please. So in local transmission planning, sorry, just if you'd go back one, thanks. In local transmission planning, the things I want to call out here that are kind of the patterns that exist for good reason, but are part of what gives rise to the frustration of how the existing process doesn't identify the big regional needs we think should be produced by this process. The local transmission process has historically been focused largely on planning for reliability purposes, which is required by NERC and is measured by the various NERC thresholds and violations. But there have been recent exceptions to this. The Greenlink project is one of those, which of course you're familiar with. Colorado Power Pathway is another one. These are exceptions because they're projects that anticipate the growth in generation of renewables in addition to load growth, and have therefore been designed with that in mind. There are exceptions to the traditional local planning, the results of local planning process, but they are still single state projects. And I think that is kind of a red flag that shows, we're doing better than we have historically done, but still the large regional projects have not been surfaced by existing planning processes. If you advance one. Thanks. So in the space of regional transmission planning today, FERC Order 1000 does require that regional planning consider needs driven by three major factors. That's economic needs, reliability needs, and public policy. And the planning processes have very clear lanes to look at projects as they might be called for by these needs. And FERC Order 1920 goes farther and expands and clarifies what drivers should be considered. We'll get to that in a second, but I just want to flag that for why Order 1920 is relevant there. And then existing regional transmission planning tariffs contain methods for cost allocation. So should a project arise from one of these processes and be selected for a regional transmission plan, there exists tariff language today that is intended to allocate the costs of those projects. For West Connect and Northern Grid, however, no project has ever been identified as a regional need, and so the cost allocation methods have never been tried. And so I think that there's a general sense that they lack detail that would be necessary to do this, and the cost allocation component of Order 1920, which I'll talk about in a moment, is going to be a key part of what that planning process does for the region. Next slide, please. So what does FERC Order 1920 do that existing planning processes don't? Order 1920 is represented in the green boxes here, and there are four major things that it does. So it requires forward-looking scenario planning based on a full range of factors expected to influence future transmission needs. It also requires evaluation of a minimum set of benefits over a 20-year horizon. And so that set of benefits is specified by FERC. That's new. And then also the time horizon of 20 years is also a new requirement. That's longer term than what's required by existing orders. And then Order 1920 also requires establishment of a default cost allocation method, and allows for the development of a state agreement process, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in a moment. Before that, just briefly on the factors and benefits. If you could, next slide, please. So the factors are things that FERC views as likely to influence the generation mix of the future, which in turn influences transmission needs. There are 7 factors that FERC mandates that long-term regional transmission planning consider. 3 of them, the top 3 on the left there, are mandatory. The next 4 must be considered but may be discounted, which was FERC's way of allowing uncertainty to come into the equation here, because many of those things are uncertain. But the main drivers that are mandatory are laws affecting the resource mix and demand, laws on decarbonization and electrification, and state-approved integrated resource plans. And so if you haven't been in the weeds of transmission planning, understanding that going from 10 years to 20 years, and then requiring consideration of generation projections from something like an IRP is actually a really big step forward in transmission planning. Existing processes typically have a 10-year load forecast and consider generation changes only if the new generation meets a pretty high threshold for certainty, meaning it's licensed and sited, in some cases even under construction. And so this expansion of FERC's requirements to go to 20 years and to consider other things that might reasonably be understood to impact the generation mix of the future, but which don't result in specific location or siting of known future generation, requires transmission planners to do a bit more speculating, or at least informed guessing, than they've historically done. And that in part will really, in our opinion, push transmission planning forward. So we're excited about that. Similar to the 7 drivers of transmission or generation and transmission needs that FERC required, there are 7 benefit categories. Some of them are technical, some of them are fairly easy to understand in English. I just want to flag 3 of them, which have these arrows here, just as examples. So benefit number 2 here, which is either a reduced loss of load probability or a reduced planning reserve margin, or kind of capacity carrying requirement. Those are concepts that you're probably familiar with, especially in an IRP context, if you've been a participant in any sort of IRP dockets, because the accreditation of new generation like wind and solar is a hot topic, of course, there. And the resource adequacy requirements to have a reliable generation portfolio in a future where many resources are weather driven. Those are really important concepts. However, translating those to a power flow analysis or a transmission planning analysis is not straightforward, and those aren't the types of analyses that transmission planners have historically done. And so that's a new and integrated thing that's going to require a lot of hard thinking and new modeling for the transmission planning groups in the West. Benefit category 3 I'm flagged simply because production cost savings are often viewed as the largest driver of benefits. That's the metric that you'll see in any of the day-ahead market studies that people have been rolling out for their EDAM versus markets plus comparisons. However, typically in transmission planning, that element of benefits is studied under what you could think of as like 1 and 2 or median conditions, but not in extreme tail events. And you may have seen recent headlines from an NREL study that showed, for existing transmission, looking back historically, something on the order of 50% of the economic benefits of most transmission is generated in only around 5% of hours, meaning it's those tail events or tail conditions that really drive the economic value of transmission. And so that leads to benefit number 6 that I've highlighted here with the arrow, noting that Order 1920 requires consideration of how new transmission facilities might help mitigate extreme weather events or unexpected conditions. And that's an example of, tail conditions coming into the fray here, not just from a reliability perspective, but maybe also an economic perspective. Next slide, please. So I want to move from Order 1920 and transition towards a discussion of, how does this relate to an RTO or and Nevada's mandate for joining an RTO by 2030, with just a quick reminder of the key differences between a day-ahead market and an RTO. And maybe this isn't necessary given the presentation that Pam just gave about what pathways is and isn't. But just a fresh reminder that in a day-ahead market, we have economic dispatch and optimization over the bulk of the majority of generation in the footprint that's participating in the day-ahead market. But what we don't have are some key features of an RTO that includes consolidation of the administration and operation of the transmission grid, including transmission planning. And so on one of the earlier slides, you may have noticed the map of the grades given to different regions by way of their transmission planning. And I have that again blown up to show you. But what you'll notice is that the RTOs tend to get better grades in how they do regional transmission planning. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that they have consolidated control and existing stakeholder processes that are generally more efficient and better resourced than the non-RTO planning groups do. Okay, so next slide, please. So back to Order 1920, just with that distinction in mind, and a couple of the things that are hot on everyone's plate right now. So Order 1920 requires a default or ex-ante cost allocation method to be established in the transmission provider's tariff. The reasoning FERC gave is that it's especially good to have a default so that you can't just kick the can down the road, which is effectively what has happened in some of the Order 1000 processes. That's the reference I made earlier to the tariff language that has yet to be tested. If you were to read that tariff language, it's not clear how it would be implemented, and so that's the test that's waiting to come. So Order 1920 requires a default cost allocation method to be established, to be on file. The second section here is perhaps more interesting. The order also allows for a state agreement process, which would give the relevant state entities the opportunity to meet and propose an alternative cost allocation method for a specific transmission facility identified in the long-term regional transmission planning process. And so it's important to note that state agreement process is permitted but not required. So if one is agreed upon and filed and approved by FERC under the order, it would allow flexibility for states and transmission providers to customize the processes and requirements to arrive at the alternative cost allocation process. So, for example, relevant state entities could determine what is meant by agreement. So, for example, would it need to be unanimous? Would a majority satisfy? How exactly or who votes to represent the interest of each state? It would also allow states flexibility to determine what specific benefits are valued in order to arrive at the cost needing to be allocated, or the cost allocation method, and specify things like the length of time for negotiating an alternative cost allocation method. There is ultimately a 6-month clock that the agreement has to be achieved 6 months, no longer than 6 months after the facility is selected in a regional transmission plan. So again, it's permitted but not required. Transmission providers are permitted to submit the process, in addition to a default regional cost allocation method if the relevant state entities agree to such a process. Advance one, please. And so in exciting news, this engagement process actually starts this week for Northern Grid, which is the regional planning group that NV Energy participates in. So the meeting is scheduled for Friday, November 1st. And if you are, as identified by the transmission owners, as one of the relevant state entities, you, or at least someone representing the agency, should have been invited to participate in this process. And so thinking ahead a little bit to how Order 1920 might be applied differently in or out of an RTO, one thing that even though a day-ahead market doesn't provide a lot of the transmission planning services that an RTO would, it does provide transparency into prices, into locational marginal prices, which reveal where transmission may well be needed. And so the Western EIM does that to an extent today with the price transparency it provides, but the volume of transactions in the EIM is much less than would be in a day-ahead market. Day-ahead market covers a much greater volume of transactions. And so we expect the price discovery or transparency to provided by a day-ahead market to be more robust in terms of identifying transmission needs. What we see as benefits in an RTO is generally more coordinated engagement and centralized modeling. So for example, SPP's 2024 Integrated Transmission Plan produced a portfolio of transmission investments that was endorsed by its highest participants committee to move forward for the board approval. And that was a portfolio of almost $8 billion of transmission investments. It got very little pushback about the size or cost from stakeholders, and the overall portfolio benefit cost ratio was in the neighborhood of 8-1. So I see that as a pretty astounding number. 8-1 benefit cost ratio is shocking, right? And so I take this to show just how much money is on the table for customer benefits in the form of transmission expansion. As another example, the CAISO 2024 transmission plan selected Idaho Wind as a resource and the SWIP North transmission line as a method to access that resource. So we're seeing the RTOs picking big transmission. Next slide, please. This is the map I mentioned earlier, and it's been making the rounds. You may have seen it before, but this is just an assessment by the National Transmission Planning Group of how well each region's doing by way of regional transmission planning. And just to highlight what I've shown is that in the RTOs, we tend to see better performance than we see in the non-RTO regions of the country. I know that I skipped a fair amount of material in the slides, just including it there so you guys can use it as a reference. But just one last slide to kind of wrap up, and then glad to take any questions. On this final slide here, it shows a little bit of the evolution of how we've seen the fits and starts advancement in Western energy markets from bilateral transactions across the bulk of the West to the EIM that does imbalance trading, intra-hour, kind of that 5-minute 5 tuning. We know we're all on the cusp of day-ahead markets expanding beyond the CAISO, and we view it as a natural evolution to one day consider the benefits of a full RTO. I guess I just wrap up by saying that I think there are a lot of benefits in the space of transmission planning in an RTO, but it doesn't mean we should wait for an RTO to really put our energy as the broader regulatory and customer advocacy community into doing good collaborative transmission planning. And so West Tech is an example of that. And we're very eager to see Order 1920 get full and robust implementation, including opportunities for stakeholders to be involved in how those tariff compliance updates and cost allocation methods are established. So with that, I'll take a breath and happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Ben, for going through the West Tech work and some overviews of Order 1920. I saw that we had a question in the chat from Elise Porto, who is with Switch, and she wanted to ask about being invited to that planning process. If they weren't invited, but it's relevant, how can they reach out to try to be included in the process? And if you don't know, if possibly that's something you can just send over to us if you could dig it up.
Well, I'll relay that I also want to be invited to that process, and so far have not been invited. In fact, I was told, sorry, it's not open to you. And so right now, at least for the initial Northern Grid meeting, the transmission owners who are hosting that have declined to make it an open meeting and have said it is only open to the representatives from the relevant state entities that they have invited. So I think this is, watch that space, stay tuned, but a regulator near you has been invited to that meeting. And to the extent you hope also to participate, representatives from regulatory commissions. And so the order defines relevant state entities as regulatory commissions and state agencies with authority over siting for transmission facilities. So depending on the state, sometimes different agencies have that siting authority. Those states have been invited. So hot topic, I'm very keen like you are to participate, and we're staying tuned to see when the TOs and or relevant state entities will open that door for us.
Okay, awesome, thanks. Any other questions from the task force members? Okay, I just have a couple questions. With West Tech, and possibly with this 1920 regional planning, is there any overlap with the siting entities like the Arizona Power Plant and Transmission Line Siting Committee or Oregon Siting Committee? I mean, I know Oregon's is a little bit different, but just wondering how those state entities or agencies are being looped into that planning.
So siting agencies, to my knowledge, have not been active participants in West Tech. There have been a number of there is kind of a broad call for public participation in a series of public webinars. I don't know to the extent they've been tuned into that, but the major venue for participation from state reps in West Tech is through the CREPC Transmission Collaborative. And so that's state commissions and energy offices collaborating to stay up to speed on what West Tech is doing, and West Tech reaches out to that group with updates and to solicit feedback. Were you asking specifically about West Tech or also Order 1920?
No, also Order 1920.
Yeah, so Order 1920, I guess I alluded to this in my previous answer, that state agencies with siting authority will be invited to the state engagement meetings, or they're required to be engaged with by Order 1920. So those processes are just beginning.
Okay, great, thanks. And then I think you kind of mentioned this, but the studies, like the 20-year studies that involve the IRPs, how are they looking at load growth, especially in the Desert Southwest and like Colorado? How are they taking that into account as they're doing the regional planning, if you know?
In West Tech, for the 10-year study, we're using the traditional bread and butter utility load forecasts, many of which have been updated based on recent changes in things, expectations like data center growth. And then for the 20-year forecast, E3 is developing a methodology to apply for all the utilities to extend from the 10-year to the 20-year horizon. There's also room for a couple scenario considerations in West Tech, and so I could see a high load growth forecast being considered as one of those. And then in Order 1920, that remains to be seen. That there won't be a consultant, as far as I know. There's no plans for a consultant hired to develop a methodology for the region, but each utility will be responsible for producing that longer term forecast. And I think that typically that's done in an IRP setting, but for transmission planning, they have to represent not just retail load, but also the whole control area's entire load. And so that'll be an interesting methodological extension to see utilities execute.
Okay, great. If there's no other questions from the task force, then thank you, Ben, so much for putting this together and for being part of this, and look forward to hearing more later about additional transmission updates and transmission planning. So thank you so much, Ben.
Excellent. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Okay. With that, we'll go ahead and bring Devin Hartman in to talk about FERC Order 2023 and siting updates. And Devin, I know it's East Coast time for you, so thanks for hanging out late with us. Where's Devin?
For sure. Yeah, happy to.
Great.
Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you all right. I just didn't see you. There you are. Okay, great.
Awesome. You see my slides all right now?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks for having me, and it's an important topic, so I'm happy to cut into dinner preparation here on the East Coast to accommodate talking to you all. I'm the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at the R Street Institute. I'll get in a little bit today here to both the status of generator interconnection reform, both with order 2023 in mind, but also sort of the unfinished business of interconnection reform. And then I know a lot of folks covered transmission, both Ben and then Julia will later. So I'll just limit the transmission chat to siting if that's possible. And then I know Jennifer and I were talking about some updates in market expansion too, and we've done a couple papers here recently, and actually just had Michelle Beck on an R Street event here a couple hours ago. So happy to kind of approach that issue with a little bit of value add from the discussion perhaps that you all have had already. If you're not familiar with us, we're a pragmatic free market think tank. We do both federal and state work, both in the regulatory domain and the legislative domain. And we have typically our staff has a mixed background of FERC, PUC folks, former market monitors. Personally, I used to be at the Indiana Commission, cut my teeth in the industry on IRP modernization, then went to FERC and was in the market monitoring group. And between my stints here at R Street, I used to run the National Trade Association for Industrial Energy Consumers, which is a note I'll kind of end on here as to kind of how we think about large load growth and making sure that Nevada is learning from other states and is ready for the future. So to start off here, I know there's been so much discussion on sort of moving towards a Western RTO. I'll just flag a couple recent pieces here. One is a paper that my colleague Mike Giberson put out yesterday, and he was on the event today with Michelle Beck. There'll be archive footage on that if anyone is interested. And then that kind of builds on a paper we did a year ago. We call the Electric Paradigms paper, which is to date been a little bit more used as a type of North Star with a lot of especially large loads moving forward and thinking about what types of electric institutional structures are most conducive to the reliability, cost, and other criteria that they have. So I think a couple things that might add value to your discussion on just the RTO front. Kind of seeing what lessons of external validity from other RTOs can be applied towards Nevada as it thinks about its future. So first off, I think on just the technical grounds, and probably doesn't need to be rehashed too much, the net benefits calculations are pretty overwhelmingly net beneficial, and they should be growing, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. Part of it is also, I think, a bit of overcoming some myths. And in sort of the spirit of Halloween here, we sort of have a piece that I provide a link here into on exorcising the ghosts of Enron. There's a lot of reasons why we haven't had an event nearly of that scale come in over 20 years. And I actually used to be in the office at FERC that was created after the Western energy crisis, so always happy to take questions on that later. But that said, RTOs do definitely present some pretty straightforward and less straightforward challenges, which we can dig into in a little bit. I know governance is always top of mind for folks, but one thing I think is that really gets missed out is that there is pretty substantial administrative and expertise costs and legal costs, both to stakeholders and state agencies involved with an RTO. You might have to add an FTE or two for a lot of these folks just to be able to interface with an RTO, and so and the stakeholder process. So that's always something for folks to keep in mind. To kind of think about this idea of like electric paradigms going forward, it's really important to note that I think that there's sort of a false dichotomy that a lot of stakeholders have of you're either in an RTO or you're not in an RTO, and that's kind of as simple as that. We actually kind of see a spectrum of wholesale and retail policies around the country. And for sake of simplicity, we kind of actually lumped it into 3 bins. You have your traditional model, vertically integrated cost of service outside of an RTO. And then on the far end of the other spectrum, you have full restructuring, everything with IPPs and reps, and in which case an RTO or really the core functions of an ISO are sort of a prerequisite to that. And so I think the more relevant, paradigm for Nevada, moving forward here is probably thinking about how you move forward with a predominantly vertically integrated cost to service paradigm and the incremental benefits you get from, if not full RTO, incremental RTO functions. And that leads me to the next point is fragmented functions of an RTO is an interesting way to do it. There can be aspects of that that are sort of reflect a cautiously optimistic approach. There can also be things, though, that you have to be careful of, which I'll mention a little bit more on here in a minute. And what functions of an RTO do you want to take baby steps on, and which ones you're better off just sort of committing to diving in. We do have some concerns with sort of aspects of the Frankenstein approach to RTO functionality based on lessons learned in other RTOs and their expansion. But then there's other things where we don't necessarily see as much ramification of having a standalone institution. So I'll elaborate on that in a little bit. So a couple things on the technical consideration side. I know you all have had so much input from stakeholders now on this, and we are definitely in the camp of seeing pretty strong evidence of RTOs, or at least the core functions of organized markets, lowering costs, and for that purpose, lowering costs to achieve reliability and environmental goals. Of course, environmental goals are not the explicit objective of tariffs under FERC jurisdiction, but we know that state policymakers typically have a degree of environmental interest in mind, as do market participants increasingly. And so I think beyond sort of the obvious, technical considerations, I think you all have probably heard a lot about. I think seams management is an interesting one that we kind of pulled out in our paper. I just flag it because it's been a little bit more of a unique challenge with sort of the conversation with the topology of the Western grid. There's a lot of weak grid characteristics on the system just by the very nature of flows on the system. And I think it's also worth noting that just thinking about like the seams management of the current mix of, was it a couple dozen plus current balancing authorities, just having consolidation on that front creates a lot of engineering and planning and operating advantages going forward that are a substantial improvement on the status quo. But it's also worth noting that even between RTO footprints, like if you look between SPP MISO and MISO PJM, you have major seams management challenges already at the interface of existing RTOs. The seams management issues are far worse outside of the RTOs, to be clear. But we would kind of note that you're going to really need to have a strong commitment to sort of like a good seams management approach, sort of as a byproduct of wherever the future of the Western line gets drawn between CAISO and SPP. And it's also, I think, worth noting for folks like the benefit cost ratios of core RTO functions should be growing pretty substantially in the long term, especially with variable, i.e. renewable and use limited resources, that is namely storage. And in fact, as a former IRP person, it's going to be increasingly difficult to do IRP as sort of like a fragmented, utility by utility IRP approach without better accounting for full regional conditions. And that's actually a big advantage of in fact being in an RTO, which I'll talk about here in the next slide. And so a couple points I think on just the non-technical aspect of RTOs. Some good points already made just today alone on governance considerations. I'll note that my predecessor in this role was Travis Kavula, who came over from the Montana Commission at the time. He did a paper for us on RTO governance where he called RTOs quangos, or quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations. And if you know Travis, he's got quite the vocabulary, so it made a lot of sense. But one of the things that we do see a lot in the literature on RTO governance, you do have to make sure that A, recognizing like accountability mechanisms need to be robust, but B, because the functionality of RTOs is so complex, a lot of stakeholders that have less skin in the game or fewer resources a lot of times get swamped in the stakeholder process. So I heard someone reference, I think it might have been Pam, to sort of like the CAPS model from PJM. It's worth really considering how sort of those dispersed beneficiaries of RTOs, as opposed to the concentrated interest players, making sure that you have good representation, not just structurally but functionally, in any type of RTO arrangement. I think the CAISO governance stuff has been pretty well covered here, so I won't get into that. I think from a state interest perspective, and I just say this as sort of like both myself and my staff having some PUC background, I think it's really important to note that as the resource mix evolves, there's a growing asymmetry between PUCs and other regulated utilities and other stakeholders on what is prudent, both on an investment basis as well as an asset operating basis. One of the big advantages, and I think overlooked advantages, of organized markets is that they can help better inform cost of service oversight by PUCs. That's something that Rich Glick, when he was the chairman of FERC, really wanted to expand further. And so I do think that that's an important point to note. So really under that sort of hybrid model, which is predominantly what Nevada would be moving towards, that's really important to get better information and better injection of higher quality information to better inform what states clearly retain autonomy over. I do think that if you do consider more broader restructuring, you do have some obvious autonomy trade-offs, and we've seen that in the Eastern RTOs play out to an alarming degree. And then I think in the interest of time, I might skip over sort of some of the RTO functions from an integrated versus multiple orgs approach. I will note that on just the resource adequacy piece, usually resource adequacy, well, it varies by RTO elsewhere. In, say, MISO, SPP, right, states are responsible for resource adequacy. There's an undercurrent of challenges with that. For example, when MISO came up short in its capacity auction a couple years ago, a lot of folks immediately responded, including the market monitor, with blaming the design of that market rather than recognizing that 94% of the underlying load was served by an IRP or IRP equivalent type of rationale process. And so you functionally really had to develop something that utilized better utility by utility coordination, where states had the ultimate oversight of the prudence of those investments. And so when you think about resource adequacy going forward, if you do it with an independent institution here in RAP, and you still have the states bought in, but that still needs to be coordinated with the future operating condition expectations of the organized market. So if you break out those functions, that would be a fairly unique institutional approach to doing this. And I'll just flag for folks that a few years back, when CAISO had rotating outages, there was a lot of finger pointing between the states and CAISO. And frankly, there's a little bit of blame to go around in terms of institutional coordination problems. Cheryl LaFleur had a really good op-ed on this. So that's just something to think about as you move forward, that institutional coordination is tricky. And this country, as it faces some overwhelming reliability challenges going forward, a lot of what boils down to is challenges in institutional alignment for reliability responsibility. So just something to keep in mind. With that, we'll jump into something that's much less controversial. That is interconnection here. So I think folks are pretty familiar probably with the interconnection problem statement we've seen generally nationwide, with the exception of ERCOT, really, that interconnection backlogs have really started going off the charts in the last few years. A lot of times, be a couple of years, say, before or less before, between interconnection request and securing an agreement. Now, depending on the RTO, it might take 5, 6+ years. Some of the RTOs just paused it, reviewing them outright because they were so overwhelmed. Obviously, this has a ton to do with the changing resource mix, and we're going from central plant more to a lot of dispersed high volume requests. But also part of it is because the grid is getting so saturated that the triggering of transmission network upgrades, which is a key test criteria, is starting to trip the process a lot. And so the generators seeking interconnection don't have much information in advance where there's going to be some slack on the system. And because the upgrades costs are assigned to the generator, typically speaking, and again, this is across the country for the most part, they're doing their due diligence. A lot of especially renewables developers will submit like half a dozen interconnection requests for the same project just because they're testing out for site selection purposes. So that's, all this is kind of said that some of the RTOs are really inundated. You don't see the same inundation in non-RTO areas. And I think there's been a little bit of a misnomer for folks that means the non-RTO areas haven't figured out. I just flagged that there's fundamental differences in open access and third-party ability to access the transmission system and secure agreements between RTO and non-RTO constructs. It's kind of like the difference between why the line at one restaurant is so much longer than another. It's usually because the restaurant with the longer line is more desirable. So that's kind of what's going on with especially a lot of the IPPs, which historically have been the big developers on the renewable front. And so let's dig into the policy side. So before we get into the aspects of Order 2023 itself, and then what it misses and comes out with, and what sort of next steps are of sort of what's not in scope, I think it's helpful just to kind of put in context some developments here, which has actually a bit of an interesting Nevada-specific story to it. So for one, FERC can only issue a rulemaking based on, of course, on what it proposes on the record. And one of the big things was that when it issued the NOPR in this proceeding, and they got all the comments back, FERC realized, hey, we just got to get this out the door. And Allison Clements had a really fascinating statement when this order went out the door of referring to a remodel and realizing that once they got in there for the remodel, they realized they had to do a lot more work to do than what they set out in the original scope. And so we actually helped organize a letter with all the national consumer groups to kind of flag this and say, hey, this isn't just a generator problem, it's a consumer problem. And the scope of the NOPR is too narrow, and thus we knew the final order, which would become 2023, was too narrow to really address a lot of the most pressing challenges with interconnection policy. So to be clear, in Order 2023, there's a few things in it they're all beneficial, but largely what it does is it raises the floor for laggard regions. And CAISO happened to be more of a leader than laggard in most aspects of interconnection. So there's not a huge incremental lift, and CAISO's already gone down the path of compliance filings. And in fact, FERC's already ruled on sort of a supplemental aspect of tweaking CAISO's interconnection process, sort of based on looking at modified specs to do a cluster study of interconnection requests rather than sort of the serial one-off approaches, which is what a lot of regions did pre-Order 2023. And so we knew that the order was going to not address many or most of the key aspects of interconnection reform. So there was a big interest to motivate supplemental action. A lot of parties then actually took this letter, went to Congress, and of all people, Senator Cortez Masto said, I'll take you up on this. We almost got Senator Cassidy to sign on to it also, so it was almost bipartisan, to say, hey, there's the unfinished business of interconnection reform we need to address. When Chairman Phillips heard about this, said FERC's going to hold a tech conference on this. That tech conference sort of soft announcement ended up being a workshop that was just held recently, actually. And I put a couple of links to some of the materials here. And so I think what you're largely going to see come out of this is that regions have already been taking steps to go beyond Order 2023, or in some cases sort of regress where they have discretion. So we've seen very mixed results with regions left to their own devices to address a lot of outstanding interconnection problems. I have to say CAISO's done a pretty darn good job. MISO and PJM, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. And so just to flag a few of the outstanding reforms that I think are worth coming in mind, because I think for takeaways, FERC is not looking at this point to probably issue a supplemental rulemaking. At this point, it's, we can't exactly, read their minds, but there's so much on FERC's plate and there's not a lot of industry appetite, and comments are coming in here on next steps in a couple weeks for FERC. But I think the general sentiment is there'll be a big industry ask for a policy statement for FERC to kind of guide and encourage regional stakeholders to do better. And so here's a couple like areas of outstanding reforms, and I think it's helpful for any region, including the West, to think about how to lead on outstanding interconnection reforms. Some of it's seems pretty basic, sometimes challenging to execute. One is just making sure that you're using accurate and consistent study assumptions and that they're transparent. Been a lot of issues with that. One that we testified on and FERC staff really was interested in from us was how to drive more cost-effective network upgrades. Interestingly, ERCOT does it all through transmission planning. They don't do it through generator interconnection requests that then get assigned to that generator to pay for. And that enables them to have a much simpler interconnection process. That's why ERCOT can process much more efficiently. It's not nearly as computationally intensive. It also turns out that when you roll network upgrades into regional or sort of sub-regional transmission planning, the network upgrade costs are typically a fraction of what they would be with an alternative approach. And so FERC staff is very interested in encouraging regions to go further on that. Again, CAISO is doing honestly a pretty good job of moving in that direction already. And then there's a couple other things out there that I think are just sort of floating. There's a lot of industry interest right now in using like advanced computing and sort of next level management practices, whether it's better staffing or other like database management capabilities to really just process the compute a lot more efficiently. That's something that FERC would never mandate, of course, but we've kind of talked to FERC staff about this idea of maybe having all the RTOs and transmission providers sort of just report on what they're doing on an ongoing, say, annual, biannual basis. And then FERC sort of has a convening on like best practices and interconnection queue management to sort of encourage that bottom up organic improvement in the systems and facilitate a lot of learning between regions. So in the report card that came out earlier this year by a couple consulting groups, Grid Strategies and Brattle, they actually, as you can tell from the overall grade, thought pretty highly of CAISO, which seems to be pretty self-motivated to pursue improvement in this arena, which is encouraging. Not so much for some other regions. But there are a couple of areas that I just put the red line around here that you could see still some significant room for improvement in the region. And I'll just do one quick slide here on transmission permitting and siting. Since it's a pretty hot topic, we're actually meeting with a few congressional offices on it tomorrow because there's some pending Senate legislation that might pass in lame duck that would modify this. But of course, it's worth noting, I think, what the status quo is. Of course, FERC has limited backstop authority at this stage. That's what's under kind of the eye of reform right now is what is the optimal role of FERC and states in permitting and siting. And there's a lot of back and forth on that one right now. Of course, states have primary jurisdiction, and that's both on intrastate but also interstate lines, which is intriguing and unusual for any form of interstate infrastructure, especially given the Commerce Clause. So thus why a lot of stakeholders have asked questions about this. And of course, there's also local authorities, varies very much by state, have a big role to play, and tribal private authority roles as well. You kind of package all this together, and building transmission is sort of like a case study in red tape. A lot of times the same project will have to go through the same type of review multiple times, sometimes the same type of, say, biological opinion or water assessment impact, even for the same entity. And then, of course, that assessment for that entity is not compatible oftentimes with what it is for another entity. So that's challenging. The thing that's also a bit challenging on transmission, especially on an interstate basis, is that a lot of times the challenge will be about driving agreement among the stakeholders on the benefits and cost allocation. And although planning and cost allocation is a separate policy arena, we have seen patterns where typically if states don't buy into the planning or cost allocation, then they'll cut the legs out of the project where they have clear authority on the siting side. And so part of it is to try to actually get better benefits accounting and understanding within those entities. A real challenge is often when you have so-called pass-through states for transmission, where there's typically primarily like pulling in, say, renewable gen from one sub-region across one or two other states and plopping it down on a load center. Obviously, those so-called pass-through states don't have as much direct benefit. They also don't really incur much or outsized costs consistent with the beneficiary pays cost allocation approach. Nevertheless, it still can sometimes be unpopular with stakeholders just to have very visible infrastructure. And sometimes the PUCs will just say, if we don't clearly need it here, we're not going to issue an approval of this project. So some states actually explicitly encourage or allow or require their PUCs to consider interstate effects. In other states, there's no consideration allowed whatsoever for benefits of other states. So while it might be the least cost transmission build for that region, if that particular state doesn't need it, then they'll sometimes oppose it. So it gets pretty tricky. We have a forthcoming paper that'll unpack some additional ideas on this front. We are, I'll flag, pretty bullish actually on a lot of merchant transmission model for interregional. There's no Order 1000 equivalent for interregional. There will probably be, my guess is there'll probably be a rulemaking that addresses interregional to meet sort of minimum transfer for reliability purposes requirements. But other than that, you're probably looking at voluntary planning and voluntary off-takers to drive a lot of interregional transmission in the absence of, say, the Senate package, which has an interregional transmission provision passing. If that doesn't pass, which I think it's unlikely to, but substantial chance still, I don't see FERC under either presidential scenario issuing a mandatory planning and cost allocation equivalent to Order 1000. So I think it will be important for states just to think about making sure that they're being open to permitting and siting practices that recognize both the full cost allocation, the traditional incumbent model, as well as the merchant model, which might be using some leverage financing. And we've already seen some states toss out projects because of that financial model. And then the last slide here that I'll leave you with, as promised, was on sort of thinking about load growth readiness. Done a lot of work with industrials in my career, and more recently we've been doing a lot of work coordinating with the data centers. And boy, you can't go with more than a day without a new news article coming out on this. So, in sort of seeing what they want, it's important to unpack that most of this load growth is in fact coming from manufacturing or traditional manufacturing, as we think about it, or data centers. Crypto is considerable too. I would note that those three clusters of load growth, for those three categories, if you will, they are cost sensitive. The hyperscalers, not as much as some of the smaller data centers, but there's still, nevertheless, you have cost sensitivities. Traditionally, industrials have actually factored in fuel costs, electricity as a fuel cost, and they need to have a global advantage in that as one of their selection criteria in a given state. But crypto is very responsive, both in its operational capabilities, but as well as its sensitivities to pricing. So this is why a lot of them will build in ERCOT so that they can just sort of turn on whenever there's a surplus of renewables in an area, and then they cut it out when there's a scarcity event. And so I think you are seeing from those large load segments, which do have a lot of siting flexibility and where they go, you're seeing a big preference for them on RTO expansion. I think a lot of you know that a lot of the Western RTO development is heavily driven by a lot of data center interests and other large loads. I've known air products companies and others interested in Nevada that have been very sensitive to whether an RTO exists and whether they have direct market access to it. And then I think also transmission practices and interconnection is something that's explicitly important to some of those firms too. Some of them have put out RFPs that have come back empty, and that's when they ask their commercial teams why are the RFPs going unanswered. A lot of times they go, no one can get an interconnection agreement right now, or increasingly. You're seeing a lot of permitting and siting challenges, state permitting and siting, not just transmission, but now especially for generation. The amount of restrictions on new generation have just really grown rapidly in most states. So you put permitting and siting restrictions and the interconnection backlog together. A lot of times it'll take a decade just to get all the approvals to build a new power plant. If you can even get it. So in a lot of areas, so that's a real concern right now, especially in an era of load growth, and that's what a lot of those firms are concerned with, and they are doing their due diligence to look at these criteria when they do some site selections. And with that, happy to take questions.
Thanks, Devin. Just wanted to see if there's any questions from the task force from Devin's presentation. Okay, just lots of good information, Devin. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all the work that your firm has done in terms of analyzing Western RTOs and all the other issues that touch on them. I guess just a quick question on the sort of load growth and the economic development elements. Would you say that you're seeing large industrial loads or large industrial customers, and maybe you said this, specifically choose places where there is a regional organized market over non-regional organized market locations?
Yeah, it's always hard to tell. It's definitely a factor. How heavily weighted that factor is always tough to tell, and these firms usually will never reveal it. But you do see sort of like an energy indicator sometimes that explicitly has RTO status in their functionality. So some of the hyperscalers in particular, you see this for. The thing I'll also note on the data centers that's fascinating right now is traditional data centers have very like low latency requirements, so they don't have a ton of siting flexibility. Think of like the Columbus issue, if you all followed that, or Northern Virginia. But what we have seen with especially newer data centers, a lot of the artificial intelligence applications, is that they don't have those same latency sensitivities. So they have a lot more siting flexibility. Thus why you're seeing some of the new age data centers say co-locate with nuclear plants, or go out in North Dakota where they can soak up extra wind, etc. So I do think data centers will be increasingly sensitive to some of these energy criteria going forward. And a lot of them, their internal government affairs teams will have meetings now in the last month where they say fixing energy issues is like an enterprise level risk to some of the hyperscalers. So it's getting serious attention, and they have a strong preference for RTOs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from the task force? All right, Devin, I will let you get back to dinner preparation on the East Coast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For sticking around and for the presentation. And with that, we will move to David Rubin with NV Energy to give us an update on their work toward the day-ahead market and their involvement in some of this, some of the FERC order work. David, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Lisa, for your help with the slides. Maybe if we could just go to slide 3, we'll kick this off. One more. Thanks. Okay, go ahead to the next one. Thanks. NV Energy has been an active participant in the development of the 2 day-ahead market options in the West, the California ISO's Extended Day-Ahead Market, or EDAM, and the Southwest Power Pool's Markets Plus. And we've worked with a number of other utilities on several studies evaluating potential benefits associated with the different markets and possible footprints. With respect to the tariff filings to implement the new markets, CAISO's EDAM tariff has been accepted by FERC, and SPP's tariff is currently pending before that commission with an order requested by November 20th, so shortly. Both of these market designs would require filings by participating transmission owners, such as NV Energy, to modify our respective open access tariffs. And we understand that PacifiCorp is planning on filing their proposed EDAM tariff amendments in November. The next slide, please. Now, our consideration of the day-ahead market participation starts with the company's positive experience with the California ISO's Real-Time Energy Imbalance Market, or EIM. The PUCN authorized our participation in the EIM in August of 2014, and the company went live in the market in December of 2015. And by any measure, I think we feel that EIM has been a tremendous success, enabling NV Energy to capture economic, reliability, and environmental benefits. Now, our decision to proceed with the day-ahead market participation as the next step is consistent with the desire of many of the other Western balancing authorities to pursue organized market expansion on an incremental basis. We feel at this point neither EDAM nor Markets Plus provides a direct pathway towards the requirement in SB 448 for the company to participate in an RTO by January of 2030. Thus, while continuing to explore all market options, NV Energy seeks to capture the additional benefits for our customers. In our most recent IRP submitted in May of this year, we stated our intention to request authorization from the Commission to participate in EDAM. And we believe participation in EDAM represents the best interest, least regrets approach to capture benefits for customers. The next slide, please. Now, with thanks to Commissioner Cordova, the PUCN staff, and other participants, the PUCN convened a series of workshops to consider the process and criteria under which NV Energy could request day-ahead market participation. And not all of the utilities in the West need to request formal approval of their regulators, but we clearly do. And so we really appreciated the effort to put this together. And importantly, these are not the full set of criteria for RTO participation. This was only focused on a day-ahead market selection, so still much more work to come. The March 4th workshop examined the procedural process for the company to request approval to join the day-ahead market. The April 3rd workshop examined the day-ahead market benefit studies, and the April 10th workshop discussed the day-ahead market designs, including presentations by CAISO, SPP, and the West-Wide Governance Pathways Committee. And then the Commission's June 21st, 2024 order found that any request by NV Energy to join a day-ahead market shall be made through separate amendments to the Energy Supply Plan outside the now pending application for their Integrated Resource Plan and Energy Supply Plan in the currently pending docket number 2405041. The order also contained an extensive list of issues for the company to address in its filing. And if I could have the next slide, please. How extensive? Well, I'm clearly not going to go through all of this. I would just simply say that our view is the company thoroughly wants us to evaluate everything. The next slide, please. So what are the key factors driving NV Energy's decision to recommend EDAM participation? First, its experience with the EIM. Second, market footprint and connectivity between the expected participants. Third, projected customer benefits. Fourth, market design. Fifth, governance. And sixth, certain intangibles. And we've looked at this decision holistically. We didn't try and put numerical weighting on anything. It was just a combination of all of these factors. And though clearly there are, I think, relationships between several of the factors, most notably footprint, connectivity, and projected customer benefits. Next slide, please. Certainly with respect to experience, NV Energy and its customers have already invested in systems to participate in the EIM. EDAM would require upgrades, but we are already interfacing with the California ISO's systems today and their model. As I noted, the EIM has demonstrated significant value, and EDAM builds from that solid platform. Importantly, NV Energy's merchant and transmission operations staffs have operating experience in CAISO's real-time environment. Next slide, please. This slide shows the benefits so far, although I think it's already out of date as the ISO's released their most recent quarterly benefit report, showing good results for the last 3 months. Through the first quarter of 2024, the CAISO has reported the EIM has produced over $5.85 billion in gross benefits. And NV Energy represents almost $522 million of that total. As noted in this slide, our benefits have increased appreciably in the last several years, and we believe that benefits are reflective of both our experience in operating in the market as well as the expanded market footprint. The next slide, please. Now, if this one looks familiar, I definitely borrowed it from the California ISO's presentation at the June 24th task force meeting. But I do think it's the best visual depiction of EDAM's advantage as represented in the dark blue dots. It is a tightly integrated system that can provide support and provide those benefits associated with that combined security-constrained least cost dispatch. As discussed in NV Energy's Brattle study, this dark footprint alone contains 46% of WEX load, 80% of the solar generation, 70% of the storage capacity, and 68% of the wind generation. Therefore, sort of providing some diverse, benefits within that footprint. And therefore, while we clearly want to keep all of the light blue dots with it, which show the existing EIM participation, as much of that as possible, even if certain entities, or even in a worst case, all of the light blue entities withdrew to Markets Plus, that dark blue footprint with its connectivity should produce extensive benefits. The next slide, please. I included this slide to illustrate a few additional issues with respect to connectivity. First, the purple shade again represents those balancing authority areas that have expressed an intention to join EDAM. And second, while we have strong interties with the Southwest, the only connection we have to the Northwest is through Path 76, the Alturas line that runs from NV Energy to the Bonneville Power Administration, with a bidirectional capacity of only 300 megawatts. Third, as illustrated in the red line, most of the ongoing major construction in the West, and this includes Gateway, Greenlink, SWIP North, Cross Tie, Transwest Express, and SunZia, are in balancing authority areas seeking to participate in the EDAM or to move wind into California, which again enhances that transmission capability and resource diversity within the expected EDAM footprint. So again, that solid core that we think holds up with the market and can only, grow and expand if others stay with it. The next slide, please. Now, the participation of Idaho Power in EDAM and the California ISO's approval of LS Power's SWIP North project, which was mentioned earlier, are really of particular importance and benefit to Nevada. Pursuant to the transmission use agreement between LS Power and NV Energy, we receive an allotment of the transmission capacity on the SWIP North line, and as noted on the line, SWIP North greatly increases the transmission capacity on the existing One Nevada line or online. So currently, NV Energy has use of all of the existing capacity on online, which is 900 megawatts north to south and 600 megawatts south to north. SWIP North increases that total capacity north to south to 2,335 megawatts and south to north to 2,245. So our allotment under the transmission use agreement would increase to 1,217 megawatts north to south and 1,172 south to north. Now, while we would retain that transmission capacity were we to join Markets Plus, there would be a seam with Idaho Power if they join EDAM as expected. But by participating in EDAM with ISO Power and the California ISO, it would maximize the benefits of this new transmission capacity by using all of that in that same market optimization. The next slide, please. Just a quick look at our benefit studies. And Brattle projected that NV Energy's EDAM benefits would range from $62 million to $149 million across different footprint scenarios. In contrast, Brattle's Markets Plus projected benefits range from minus $17 million, basically a loss from our EIM participation today, to $16 million. Now, that middle group one that produced the highest projected benefits for NV Energy included not only us, but CAISO, PacifiCorp, Portland General Electric, Bank SMUD, LADWP, Idaho Power, and Seattle City Light. And that latter is the only entity that has not expressed a market intention as of yet. Now, that study can be found on our OASIS and in much more detail under the Western Markets Development tab. The next slide, please. Now, our policy group has identified several market design elements in which we prefer the EDAM approach. First is congestion rent allocation, in which the EDAM methodology, which assigns the dollar to NV Energy as the transmission provider, allows us to take those congestion payments. We don't retain them, but we would be able to then treat all customers equally by dispersing it back based on the usage of the system. In other words, our view is everybody's paying the same rate for the same firm quality transmission under the OAT, and this allows us to treat everybody in that same and equal manner. In contrast, Markets Plus, the congestion is played to specific customers based on reservations and not schedules, and we believe this can create winners and losers amongst our transmission customers. There are differences when you get into an RTO environment and folks are both allocated congestion revenue rights but can protect themselves and do other things by purchasing additional rights in the market. That's not part of these day-ahead market designs. And so we're more comfortable, again, as a transitional process and incremental improvements with that EDAM methodology. Second is on virtual bidding, where we have concerns, and this is coming out of things that we've seen in the past, where virtual bidding existed for a while on the California ISO Interties, but it was suspended because certain defined pricing patterns allowed financial speculators to profit from virtual bidding with no discernible market benefit. And that led to sort of tens of millions of dollars of charges before it was finally suspended and then eventually done away with by FERC. Sort of learning from that experience, we feel that EDAM has a slower and more considered path towards implementation of any virtual bidding. However, in Markets Plus, virtual bidding would go live after only 6 months. Third, greenhouse gas policies, in which EDAM's approach to GHG issues is based on an enhanced version of the EIM methodology that has been acceptable, while the company has greater concerns that under the Markets Plus approach, it could lead to GHG zones, which are basically states with carbon pricing policies such as California and Washington, impacting the prices that states like Nevada that do not have similar policy would pay as part of our LMP. And fourth, resource efficiency, where we have greater confidence in the ability of EDAM with the resource efficiency test and the FERC-approved imbalance reserve product to handle intraday uncertainty in a reliable manner. The next slide, please. If I could have the next slide, Lisa, thanks. Governance. Oops, sorry, I got you too far, but you can leave it on that one. We're fine. Governance, SCP has an independent 10-member board of directors, and oversight of Markets Plus is delegated to an independent 5-person Markets Plus independent panel, and one of the 5 is to be a board member. And Pam did a great job in explaining how the Westwide Governance Pathway Initiative has resulted in significant changes to the oversight of the EIM and EDAM. We have had a representative, me, on the launch committee, and we've really been greatly impressed with that effort, the cooperation, as she indicated, and frankly, the results of it. But also, as discussed by Pam, board oversight is only part of the governance structure, and a key component of that is the stakeholder process to consider new market initiatives and reforms. I'll talk about that on the next slide. And then finally, just that reminder that FERC is the ultimate arbiter of the justness and reasonableness of the market design as reflected in the tariff. Okay, Lisa, now if I could have that slide. The next one, thanks. Okay, Markets Plus uses a stakeholder-led process in which staff has a more passive role. In the California ISO process, the stakeholders represent their interests, and staff has a more active role in balancing positions. And we see a number of advantages to the CAISO approach. First, staff involvement helps protect minority interests that can get overruled by SPP's deterministic voting structure. Greater use of written comments in the CAISO process allows fuller definition of positions and earlier review by the governing body who cannot attend all of the stakeholder meetings. Also, the California ISO's initiative-specific process is less bureaucratic than SPP's formal committee structure and can react more quickly to emerging events. And then finally, again, with thanks to Pam and Kathleen Stacks of Western Freedom and the rest of the launch committee, the Westwide Governance Pathway Initiative has made further improvements to the process, including greater use of indicative voting and additional involvement of stakeholders in determining which issues to investigate. And then maybe I'll take a quick shot at Mr. Hansen's question about how would the 704B customers sort of relate to this process. And first, with regard to the board, I think it's important to remember that the RO board, which is sort of this sort of extension and growth from the existing independent governing body will have, 7 members who are not affiliated with any sector. So the board is independent. But secondly, on that stakeholder representative committee, there is to be a seat for large customers on it. So there would be a sector with that the casinos or the mines or large industrials in the state could join. And then third, in the ISO process, any entity can participate in the stakeholder process, either individually or collectively as a group, with no fee. And then in this indicative voting process, all of us will be just voting our own, positions. And what we really feel that does, and the advantage here is, frankly, when we participated in the state SPP process, there were a lot of times where we just outvoted by a block from the Northwest. So there were sort of more Northwest entities, fewer Southwest entities. They voted a block. We tended to vote more individualistically. And as a result, it was pretty clear who could sort of, drive that process. Here where you have, staff there as not a mediator, but a facilitator, and able to sort of step in and protect minorities. But also we can get, I think, an indication with indicative voting as a state issue. So, for example, if we saw comments either from the PCN, BCP, us, or the large industrials in the state, or even collectively, if there was some issue such as the GHG policy that Nevada had a state position on that all of us put in comments collectively, that gets reflected in this potential indicative voting process. Importantly, that vote is not dispositive of future action the way it is in SPP. And I think that really helps us potentially as a region with fewer participants numerically in the process in making sure that our interests are protected. Next slide, please. I also probably should give a shout out to Michelle Beck, and I do think Mr. Figueroa was spot on there. And one of the things that she did, with us, and I think this came up with the BCP presentations at the workshop, is the need to get funding to the consumer advocate groups. And that is something that NV supported in the recent comments we filed on Pathways Step 2. So we could be looking at tariff funding for them to have some support to be able to participate directly in the stakeholder process, as well as maybe using tariff funding for the BOSSer to continue or expand their support. Because I certainly agree with, I think, the statement that was made earlier here. You do need to be a participant in that stakeholder process, that waiting for initiatives to come before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is definitely too late to get heard. And then in the intangibles, NV Energy has a high confidence that the California ISO, Pacificorp, Portland General, and the other first movers will stand up the EDAM market, and that EDAM will have the connectivity to produce benefits for customers. We have less confidence in Markets Plus, even if entities spend $150 million necessary to build out the SPP design. There's an increased risk that participation in Markets Plus could lead to substantial expenditures with limited results. There's no exit fee in EDAM, whereas we're NV Energy to participate in Markets Plus, the company could be responsible for incurred capital costs. And thus with EDAM, there's a greater assurance of recovery of implementation costs, and the lack of an exit fee is consistent with NV Energy's least regrets approach. The next slide, please. The company is currently targeting the filing to request authorization to participate in the EDAM in the second quarter of 2025. We want to complete the currently pending IRP And this timing will allow for potential further definition of market footprints and provide needed time to work on identifying our system upgrades. It also allows us to see the reaction to PacifiCorp's EDAM OAT filing at FERC and potentially the Portland General filing, which is expected in January of 2025. Importantly, waiting until that time in the second quarter of 25 for our filing would not affect the earliest possible date for us to go live in the market of spring of 2027. The next slide, please. Now, just, this slide, and you've seen similar ones for it already today, was just taken from the presentation by Spencer Graham at the last meeting, and I included it only as a reminder and reaffirmation that the day-ahead market is an incremental step. Now, clearly, a lot of work goes ahead towards further RTO services across what we hope is a broad Western footprint. The next slide, please. Turning to sort of our view of Order 2023, or what we've been doing, as noted that the order was issued in July of 2023 and became effective in November of that year. Some highlights from the order include the use of an annual cluster study process. Additionally, Order 2023 specifies allocations of study costs and responsibilities for network upgrades, and imposes a penalty if a customer withdrawal from the queue has an impact on the cost and timing of other interconnection customers. Importantly, the order eliminates our reasonable effort standard and introduces penalties if a transmission provider such as NV Energy fails to meet study deadlines. Our compliance filing was submitted in April of 2024, and we requested an effective date of July 1st. Unfortunately, FERC has not acted yet, but nevertheless, FERC's decision can be made effective going back to July 1st. So given that we fundamentally relied on FERC's pro forma open access tariff, basically their prescriptive language, we've gone forward and are moving as if the compliance filing is effect. This is sort of different from the typical FERC process, but one which I guess the commission anticipated them not getting all the orders out, because they specifically stated that this was an acceptable approach in order number 2023A, and they've ratified this approach in a recent El Paso case. So the new rules are applying to any project without an interconnection agreement executed before July 1st of 2024. And we will begin accepting new interconnection requests during a 45-day cluster request window that will be held annually, with the first one starting in June 15th of 2025, and then these will run from June 15th to July 30th of each year. The next slide, please. Now, a critical issue for the state like Nevada with such a high percentage of federally controlled land is what constitutes site control, which FERC defines as the exclusive land right to develop, construct, operate, and maintain the generating facility. And site control can be demonstrated by documentation establishing ownership of a right to develop the site, an option to purchase or acquire the site, or any other demonstration of the right of the interconnection customer to exclusively occupy the site. The interconnection customer must provide evidence of 90% site control at the time of submission of the request and 100% site control at the time of the execution of the facility study agreement. Now, prior to Order 2023, an interconnection customer could submit a deposit in lieu of physical site control. Under the new rules, the interconnection customer can still use a deposit where regulatory limitations may prohibit the customer from obtaining site control. However, the customer still then needs to demonstrate physical control within 180 days of execution of the interconnection agreement. The intent clearly, we think, of these new rules is to have more shovel-ready projects ready to enter the queue and be studied. The next slide, please. We've put out a business practice that identifies different ways interconnection customers can demonstrate site control. And for example, on the land controlled by the BLM, for sites subject to the competitive leasing process of BLM lease agreements, sort of the winners of the process, or for BLM non-competitive process sites by obtaining the right-of-way grant. Now, we had some late file challenges in our FERC compliance docket, raising the issue of what constitutes site control on the BLM land not subject to the auction. One intervener proposed to use a plan of development and a cost recovery plan. That left us with a concern, though, that there still may be, as many as sort of 4 or 5 years after that before that final grant would happen. As a compromise, we offered to use a BLM notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement because we understood under the BLM rules that an EIS is to be issued within 1 year after that notice of intent. And our thought was at least that provided some certainty as to the timing of the process. And this matter is pending before FERC, and we hope to get a decision from the commission shortly. The next slide, please. As to the current status of our interconnection queue, while I understand we don't have 500,000 megawatts in our queue like CAISO does, we started pre-order 2023 with 70,000 for a state with a peak load below 9. So transmission or the interconnection planning has really been hampered by this ability for our team to really know what projects are really moving forward and where we would be needing to move the output of that unit, to serve what load. We can't simply just dump everything off state because CAISO's queue is oversubscribed, but so is Arizona, Idaho, Pacific Corps. All of our neighbors are in this position, and I think that's really what we're hoping to see from the reforms of Order 2023. So currently we have 183 projects in our queue with a combined capacity of over 52,000 megawatts. Now, FERC permits customers to suspend work for up to 3 years, and we have 88 projects totaling approximately 30,000 megawatts in suspension. And again, that was our concern with the BLM is if you have, 3 or 4 years in that process, and then they could suspend for 3 years on top of that, you could have a project sitting there for, 7 or more years without moving forward. At the same time, we have to plan and continue to sort of view them as an active project to account for in our studies. So we have 33 projects in the study phase currently with a combined capacity of 9,856 megawatts and 62 projects with executed interconnection agreements actively in development totaling 12,287 megawatts. So after NV Energy put Order 2023 into effect, we've seen 39 projects with a capacity of 18,062 megawatts withdraw from the queue. Now, those projects can re-enter the queue in future clusters if they're in a position to meet the new requirements, but we do sort of view this as sort of the benefits of Order 2023 coming into play and really trying to get to the point where it's really the more viable projects that go through. We think that lets us plan better. It lets us go to the PUCN with better requests for what upgrades are truly needed. It frankly helps those projects because they're not part of a cluster with many speculative projects that would lead to much larger upgrade allocation costs. And then it helps us put more steel in the ground and get that construction moving because, again, everything is based on a more accurate and viable view of what can go forward. So it's really not the end of a process here, but some encouraging signs that the order has us moving in the right direction. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jennifer, for any questions.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate all the information and updates on NV Energy's movement towards EDAM. Does anybody on the task force have any questions? David, I have several questions, but in the interest of time, wondering if it would be possible to either have you maybe provide written responses to some of these questions, if that would be acceptable.
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Let's just do that because it's, I know Julia's been hanging on for a really long time and I want to be able to get her out of here and get you out of here as well, David. So if nobody has any questions, thank you so much again, David. Really always appreciate your input. And we will go ahead and move on to Julia Selker, who will tell us about GETS.
Oh, all right. You can hear me. That's first step.
Can hear you. Great. Yep.
Great. And then the second step is a screen share. Okay. Do you want to share the screen or? All right. Sounds like you've got it under control. All right. Well, thanks. Oh.
I can do either, whatever you prefer.
Okay. This works. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm Julia Selker. I'm the executive director of the WATT Coalition that's working for advanced transmission technologies. So we're the trade association for grid enhancing technologies, which you may have heard of before. If you go to the next slide, I'll walk through the agenda. So we're going to start out with who's the WATT Coalition. I'll mention what Order 1920 had on advanced transmission technologies, talk through each of the technologies and the benefits of them, and then why we don't see them everywhere on the grid today, and the policy that's has been implemented or is in progress to get them more widely deployed. The next slide. Great. So the first two rows of this list plus Prisma Photonics are the grid enhancing technology vendors. They provide hardware, software, both that dynamically increase the capacity, efficiency, reliability, or safety of power lines faster and at lower cost than traditional infrastructure. And a key word that's not bolded on this slide is dynamically. So the capacity unlocked by these technologies could depend on the weather, could depend on load or generation patterns. So they really represent a different way of thinking about the grid, and that's a primary reason why these vendors got together and formed a coalition back in 2017. Then in the bottom two rows of this page, you'll see perhaps some familiar names in the clean energy development space, as well as AES and Velco, two utilities. And these companies don't make grid enhancing technologies, but they see the urgent need for more transmission capacity at low cost. And that's why they're part of the WATT Coalition. And our mission is to get policy in place that supports the wide deployment of GETS to accelerate clean energy and lower energy costs. Next slide, please. So in Order 1920, some rules for the consideration of these technologies were laid out. Dynamic line ratings, advanced power flow control, and topology optimization, which they call transmission switching in this case, are the grid enhancing technologies. Advanced conductors are also very valuable, but they just don't have that dynamic element and can be more expensive than traditional upgrades. So that's why they're in a separate category from GETS. But for each transmission need in both the long-term 20-year planning and in Order 1000 processes, which happen more often, I think every 2 years, GETS will need to be evaluated in transmission planning. Next slide, please. And so that evaluation has to be for both new facilities and for upgrades, and whether the advanced transmission technology, I think actually alternative transmission technologies in the orders, we have a lot of different acronyms here, would be more efficient alone or in addition to traditional upgrades. So I think that line in the sand is very clear, and I hope that it will be easy to implement. for Nevada and all the other across the country. Everyone has to meet this standard. So that's the background from Order 1920. There's also a requirement in Order 2023 on generator interconnection to consider several gets. And there's also an active advance notice of proposed rulemaking at FERC about dynamic line rating specifically. So this isn't the only context in which gets are moving, but I know it's salient to today. And we'll talk about some of the other policy later. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the three technologies that I work with the most. Dynamic line ratings are sensors or software, but the sensors are normally installed near or on the transmission lines to measure ambient capacity or even the behavior of the transmission lines and find the true carrying capacity of the line. So with static line ratings, the capacity of the line was considered static. With ambient adjusted ratings, which are required by FERC in Order 881 and will be implemented by next year in the summer, utilities will have to consider the ambient temperature. So if it's freezing outside, they can't, that will greatly increase the capacity of a transmission line compared to a hot summer day. However, the biggest factor in line capacity is wind speed. So with dynamic line ratings, you're including wind speed. Different systems will include different other factors, but it'll include solar radiation, potentially precipitation, and other factors to calculate the true capacity. And so with ambient adjusted ratings, you often get like 10 to 15% more capacity. With dynamic line ratings, you can generally double the capacity that you get from AAR. But these are just guidelines. Every line is a little different. And so it depends on implementations. That's DLR. Advanced power flow control are devices that go at the substation. And then because the different circuits intersect and power is redistributed at the substation, the power flow controllers can move power from overloaded lines to lines with additional capacity. So I hope the graphic isn't too small to be useful here, but you can see in the cartoon, in one case, one of the lines could be limiting the transfer of power to load. But if you're able to install power flow controllers that decrease the flow on one circuit and are able to increase it on another, that could balance transfer capacity and greatly increase it that way. And topology optimization is software that calculates switching operations that can be taken to redirect power. So less advanced than advanced power flow control in some ways, but in another sense, it's very complicated because identifying the impacts of these reconfigurations is pretty complicated. In the cartoon example, you'll see that there was congestion on one line and curtailed generation, and was actually switching off a completely different line that balanced the flow over the whole system and unblocked that generation. So this software lets grid operators and planners evaluate a lot of scenarios much faster and find that extra capacity. For economic reasons, these grid reconfigurations are already used for reliability purposes, but because it's so resource intensive without topology optimization software to identify them, they're not common practice for economic congestion, for instance. All right, so next slide. I was really excited to see this in the New York Times in April of this year. The president and chief executive of Edison International in California, he was also the chairman of the Edison Electric Institute, the trade group for utilities, said that they're seeing a lot more interest in grid enhancing technologies and that there's a sense of urgency to deploy them. So that was a bit of a sea change in my perspective, but we're excited that these technologies are getting more notice and that the need is becoming more evident. Though it does mean there are some challenges that are growing at this point. Anyways, next slide, please. So this is the summary of the benefits. I'm going to dig into each one in more detail. But first of all, grid enhancing technologies can save money. So grid congestion or redispatch costs are what are a measure of how much the transmission grid is limiting the delivery of the lowest cost generation. In non-RTO regions, this is not really transparent. or necessarily a big factor. The constraints tend to be more at the utility boundaries in non-RTO regions, but studies in RTO regions show that these costs can be reduced often by 40% or more with grid enhancing technologies. And then these technologies are just cheaper than building a new transmission line or rebuilding a transmission line. That we generally see projects where if an alternative was studied, the GET solution was 1/20th to 1/200th the cost of the traditional upgrade. And then in Belgium, this is an example directly from Belgium, they find 20% more capacity over 90% of the time with their dynamic line rating deployment. So that's a pretty standard result. And then by unlocking more capacity on the grid, you can plug in more low-cost generation. You could plug in more load as well. So they're important solutions. And then GETS just can be deployed on the grid faster. Even scheduling an outage to do a grid upgrade can take years. Whereas GETS can often be installed without an upgrade or with a very short upgrade outage. Excuse me, they can be installed without an outage or with a very short outage, a week instead of multiple months. So that makes it much faster to install these technologies. And they're also modular. So they kind of come off the shelf and can be used in most situations. And then reliability. AES has a great report on how they use dynamic line ratings to identify which segment of a transmission line they needed to reconductor instead of reconductoring the whole line. They're able to make informed decisions that have the same reliability impact, but at lower cost. And so if we can get a feedback loop from these technologies into planning, that'll be where we unlock a whole new slew of benefits. But having sensors on your transmission lines and having control over how the transmission system works helps support reliability, gives operators optionality in challenging circumstances. And some devices can monitor for specific risks like icing or galloping or wildfires. So it depends on what type of dynamic line rating, for instance, solution you're looking at. All right, so I'm going to dig into these a little bit more. Next slide, please, just to reinforce these points. Here you can see the current interconnection queues based on the last LBNL report. They're growing still. And the next slide, this is the picture I have in my head for how generators feel sitting in this queue. They see basically a closed lane on the freeway because GETs are not being used to optimize the transmission system. So one example is in an interconnection study, a developer saw 3% line overload in a high wind scenario. So in a normal operations, the line would not be overloaded, but in high wind, a wind farm would be generating a lot, and that was going to require a $50 million line rebuild. But DLR often unlocks more than 10% of the time, more than 10% more capacity all of the time, right? So there wasn't, the utility in this case was not willing to consider DLR as an alternative or study it at all. So we're hoping that will change over time, and that's a way to get more clean energy on the grid. Next slide. So this is an example of topology optimization. This is a picture of the Southwest Power Pool, and you see a significant wind curtailment, partially due to a transmission overload. And with topology optimization, just opening and closing circuit breakers, sending power on different transmission lines, they were able to totally resolve this curtailment, which, as you can see, caused huge differences in electricity prices in real time. And so by using all of the grid enhancing technologies, the Brattle Group did a study in Kansas and Oklahoma that found that they could increase transmission capacity by enough to double the amount of clean energy that could interconnect without any additional upgrades. So it's a really significant amount of capacity that can come from these low-cost tools. Next slide. To reinforce the kind of timeliness question, this is a chart from NEMA that goes on for 2 more pages about all of the chutes and ladders that new transmission infrastructure goes through over years. So the flip side is that GETs can be deployed in months at a very low cost. we avoid this whole game if we can use GETs instead of traditional upgrades. Not that we won't have to build more transmission, but GETs can also be a stopgap solution because they can pay for themselves in months. In addition to being installed very quickly, it could be worth it to put DLR on a transmission line, even if you know a new line will come into service and relieve that congestion or constraint. Next slide. Just to reinforce the point about reliability, the final report on the August 2003 blackout recommended that dynamic line ratings be broadly implemented to, excuse me, to increase line monitoring and increase transmission capacity. Part of the cause of the 2003 blackout was a transmission line sagging into vegetation. It was a very still, hot day. So it could be, and the dynamic line rating companies generally find this, that there are some hours of the year when a line is overrated, even with a static line rating, because the assumptions aren't conservative enough. So where DLR can be deployed, you can decrease risk that way. Next slide. Cool. So transmission is really a fundamental obstacle to the next generation of electricity generation. We need more transmission capacity. So the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act are really contingent on rapidly increasing the pace of transmission capacity expansion. We don't have to build all of this through new lines. We can use the grid we already have. Next slide. All right, and so what is the state in the US? The first operational DLR deployment, I believe, started out in 2021. They were awarded the Edison Electric, the Edison Award by the Edison Electric Institute, recognizing innovation. And so this was in Pennsylvania, and they deployed DLR on 2 lines, and the congestion went from $60 million one year down to less than $2 million the next year. There were other factors at play that really increased the cost of congestion, but the expected savings are still very high ongoing, and they were able to get this DLR system in place in about a year compared to reconductoring or rebuilding the line, which would have taken several years, including outages when this line is obviously seriously needed. But many of the dots on this map here are just pilot projects. Very few are fully operational. We're seeing more and more, but it's not a quick transformation. Not that anyone expects it to be. The changing the technologies that are used on the bulk electric system is is important to take that seriously and slowly. But dynamic line ratings have been available since the late 90s, early 2000s. So these are fully commercialized. They're ready for deployment, and it is a matter at this point of accelerating the pace of adoption to unlock these benefits. Next slide. And so these are really the barriers that we see blocking GETs today. So the question, I think, for both the regulator side and the utility side is innovation on the agenda? Is it seen as something that customers are looking for and that utilities are embracing? There are a lot of benefits to be unlocked here. So is there momentum behind this transformation? And that'll help with prioritizing system and process changes, because like I said, you have to think about the grid differently to use these technologies. You have to see it as a dynamic and dispatchable and flexible asset in a way that today's grid planning doesn't do. And that means that a lot of US experts don't have expertise in these specific technologies. So the Watt Coalition is working on developing more resources, providing guidance on how to model these technologies and how to build them into operations. But fundamentally, every utility engineer is going to have to learn how these work, and that will take time. But it also, we need GETs to become one of the top priorities for these, for system operators and for utilities, for them to undertake this change. And part of why this change has been slow is because the incentives are not aligned. The utilities aren't necessarily rewarded for optimizing the transmission grid. They generally have a cost of service business model where they make money for building new infrastructure, and these are really low cost, low capital costs compared to traditional infrastructure, and higher operational costs in terms of managing line ratings and making operational decisions. So we're working on aligning changes for these policies or for these barriers through policy. So if we could jump forward 2 slides here to get into the policy. So these are some approaches that are being taken at the state level. Public utility commissions have been launching, investigations, put out a docket with a few questions. How are you evaluating these technologies? What benefits could be seen? What are barriers to implementing them? So Colorado did this several years ago. Texas had a similar docket focused on DLR. So that's a good starting point. There is a potential at the state level to require GETS as a step in certain transmission planning activities. Really, the main one that is under state jurisdiction is the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, which utilities have to go for new rights of ways. Generally, the Watt Coalition's perspective is if a utility is going for a CPCN, they probably need that new transmission infrastructure. But by saying, we want to see that you've tried optimization first before going to expansion, that's a way to kind of set the state priority that way and begin pushing for change. Washington State put a return on equity adder in place for going after federal money. There is one more round of Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnerships program funding for GETS. I believe for all kinds of things, but GETS are a good way to go after that money. The Secretary of Energy herself has said that they're a priority for these programs. So just recently, 185 million new dollars in federal awards were announced this month for grid enhancing technology projects. So really encourage everyone to encourage their utilities to go after that final round of funding. And then finally, laws in Minnesota and California are requiring grid enhancing technologies. Oh, and I'm sorry, I copied this link or this page over from a different presentation that also covered high performance conductors. So that's HPCs. And as you can see, many of these policies support both sets of technologies. So Order 1920 requires GETS in transmission planning, but specific state laws can be helpful as well in terms of specifying further benefits that should be studied. The Minnesota law requires transmission lines with a certain amount of congestion to be evaluated for GETS deployment. So there are different approaches to this. Next slide. So what's going on at the federal level? First of all, the White House and 22 governors launched the Modern Grid Deployment Initiative, which is a goal to upgrade 100,000 miles of the grid within 5 years. That is still just starting up. If you have an in with the California governor, you could encourage them to join the Modern Grid Deployment Initiative. So that's one good thing. The Department of Energy, as I said, has billions of dollars of programs that can fund GETS, that can kind of it can fund the cost of change, which is an initial upfront cost, preparing the energy management systems, et cetera, to use these technologies. But then once you get over that hump, you've got all these operational and planning cost savings. So the DOE is ready to help utilities get over that threshold. California won $600 million in a federal grant for DLR and reconductoring projects across the state. And that's just one example. Like I said, there's, I think 28 different states have had some grant for GETS, and Nevada did actually receive a research grant about DLR. So more opportunities there. Let's see. So then a few FERC orders in play here. Order 881 mandates that RTOs accept DLR and that utilities use ambient adjusted ratings. Order 2023 requires the consideration of advanced power flow control and in-generator interconnection, and topology optimization and dynamic line ratings are optional, not required. So encourage everyone to push for those in Order 2023 compliance. RTOs and utilities could decide to add them to their practices for interconnection. And Order 1920 requires GETS in all Order 1020 or planning processes. Next slide. Then a little bit more, there's an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to require dynamic line ratings in some cases, generally around a congestion threshold. In non-RTO regions, it's a little more complicated to figure out which lines are constrained because it's not reported in the way it is in an RTO. So FERC is still working on that. But one benefit of joining an RTO is that you get that transparency and you find the efficiencies that may not be visible in a non-RTO region. And then additional proposals, there's the concept for a potential direct incentive for GETS, where if a utility identified a opportunity for GETS that would save money, they could keep a share of the savings instead of relying on that cost of service model to compensate them for this investment, since that breaks down a little bit with these low costs. And then there is also a proposal that has come before FERC about transmission planning monitoring. So like there's a independent market monitor, there could be transmission planning monitors who ensure that the grid is being optimized properly and that investments are justified. There are various views on what that monitor should do, but one thing they could do is study grid enhancing technologies and suggest different applications. And that's the end of my slides. I do have a big appendix if you're trying to get into more technical resources or understand the technologies better, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Julia. And again, thank you so much for hanging in so late on the East Coast. Does anybody on the task force have any questions? Okay. Julia, I particularly appreciate the discussion of policy initiatives that are helping to move GETS forward. So thank you for drilling down into that a little bit. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked David in the interest of time. If there's a couple questions I have, if you wouldn't mind just maybe shooting them back in the form of written responses. But I think that this is a really important piece of the puzzle to optimize transmission and accelerate our opportunities for deployment of projects onto the transmission lines. So thank you so much again. Really, really appreciated you being able to be with us today. So thank you and have a great night, Julia.
Thanks.
Okay, with that, we'll move on to our second public comment period. If anybody has any public comments, please notify us by hand raise. Okay, seeing none, I just want to let the task force members know that our next meeting will be November 19th. That will be to review the report that we are required by statute to submit to the governor and legislature. So if anyone has any questions or issues, just want to make sure we have a quorum for that meeting. And with that, absent anybody else having comments or concerns from the task force, I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Oh, Turner has a question.
Madam Chair, we have Pam's presentation online, but will the other presentations be made available to the task force members?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Everybody have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for sticking around for another long and info-packed meeting, and we'll see you on November 19th. Thanks, Leslie.